Want to surprise your opponent right from move 2? The bishop's opening is a sneaky yet powerful weapon that targets the vulnerable f7 square early, setting traps while keeping your options wide open. The bishop's opening arises from the first moves: pawn to a4, pawn to a5, bishop to c4. This move gets your opponent off their typical opening preparation while remaining perfectly sound and solid. The most common response you'll encounter from black is knight to f6, which we will focus on. This develops the kingside knight and simultaneously places pressure on the e4 pawn. There are several good ways for white to respond. One of the simplest is to develop your queenside knight with knight to c3. If black then continues with bishop to c5, another logical and standard developing move, there's an interesting alternative for white. Instead of proceeding with the usual knight to f3, you can choose to play pawn to d3, delaying the development of your kingside knight. Why? Because you have a different plan in mind. If black follows up with pawn to d6, rather than developing the knight, you now push pawn to f4. This setup creates powerful possibilities for future expansion and pressure on the king side, because now you have this f-pawn, which is helping you to potentially open up the f-file in the future, let's say after you castle and have your rook positioned there. It's also ready to be pushed further to f5, giving you some space advantage. All in all, this sets you up for a strong attack in the middle game. You have a kind of improved version of the king's gambit, where you play the same f4 move, but it's not a sacrifice because this pawn is protected, therefore your opponent can never simply win the pawn. In addition to that, you're setting a clever trap. After you play pawn to f4, which may not look like a traditional move, since the usual move would be knight to f3, your opponent might think it's a mistake and try to punish you by playing knight to g4. Now, the knight and bishop work together to put pressure on the f2 square. Either the bishop can capture on f2 to attack your king, or the knight can jump there in the future, threatening both your rook and queen on d1. Therefore, it looks pretty unpleasant for white, but here you play another sneaky move, pawn to f5. You simply gain space advantage on the king side and you don't ignore your opponent's threats. In fact, you almost invite black to execute them. Why? Because now, with this pawn on f5, you block the dark-squared bishop of black. This bishop can no longer defend the knight on g4, and if black plays any random move, you can simply go ahead and capture that sniper bishop on g4. Because of this, black is more or less forced to play knight to f2, which looks great for black at first glance. It hits the queen and the rook, creating a fork, and black may believe they're about to win the game. But then you respond with queen to h5, and all of a sudden, you begin an extremely powerful kingside attack, seemingly out of nowhere. Now, the threat is very simple. Queen captures on f7, which is supported by the light-squared bishop, and that would be checkmate. Black might think, no problem, I'll just castle, since they were planning to do so anyway. But then you follow up with bishop to g5, bringing one more piece closer to black's king. What can black do here? Well, their queen is under attack from your bishop, so they must move it. However, black's f-pawn is pinned by your bishop. They cannot push it forward because that would expose their king, which is against the rules of chess. Therefore, black would be forced to move their queen somewhere. After that, you continue bringing more and more pieces closer to black's king, starting with your knight to d5. From this square, the most obvious threat is attacking the pawn on c7, which can lead to a fork of black's king and rook. But in addition to that, there is a hidden trap, one that your opponent is likely to overlook. And even if they do notice it, there's very little they can do to stop it. Let's say black goes ahead and finally captures your rook in the corner on h1. Now, instead of taking the pawn on c7, which is a perfectly fine option, you have a much stronger move, knight to f6, giving a check to the king. This knight is supported by your bishop, and it also supports queen capturing the pawn on h7. Therefore, black has no choice but to capture the knight. Once the knight is captured, you respond with bishop takes f6. And from here, white's plan becomes crystal clear. You will play queen to g5, giving check, and on the following move, queen to g7, which would be checkmate. Because of your complete domination on the king side, there is simply nothing black can do to stop this. It's a clean win, a very straightforward checkmate. What makes this variation so beautiful is that you played risk-free. Even if black does not fall for the trap, you still retain a strong and solid position, but they are very likely to fall into it. Now let me show you something quite surprising. We will now look at the most played moves from the Lichess database one by one. If you begin with pawn to e4, the most common reply from black is pawn to e5. Instead of the classical line with knight to f3 followed by bishop to c4, where black usually responds with knight to f6, you deviate with knight to c3. Once again, the most common reply from black is bishop to c5. You continue with pawn to d3, and black often responds with pawn to d6. Now, instead of all standard lines, you push your f-pawn to f4. Once again, the most played response by black is knight to g4. Then you follow with pawn to f5, and here is where the win percentage for white climbs to 76%, shown by the Lichess database. After the continuation knight to f2, queen to h5, and further moves, that means this line is not only powerful in theory, it actually performs extremely well in practice. You can clearly see from the statistics that white is dominating in this position, and usually after black castles, their position collapses quickly under pressure. Bishop to g5 is basically a straight-up win for white. What's really cool about this line is that you can see you're very likely to win because the most frequent responses from black are exactly what we've just analyzed. Wishing you lots of success with this powerful line. Now let's move on to trap number 2. We will see how to counter the bishop's opening if it is played against you. In the bishop's opening, white typically plays bishop to c4, followed by knight to f6 from black. One of the most aggressive ways white can respond here is by playing pawn to d4, immediately putting pressure on the center. After recapturing the pawn, white plays e5 to chase your knight. It looks aggressive, but it's not the best choice. Instead of retreating, strike back with the powerful counterblow d5, attacking white's bishop, opening the center, and freeing your pieces. This move completely shifts the momentum in your favor. In this game, white responded by moving the bishop back to b3. Now, your knight can advance comfortably to e4, taking a powerful central position. White then played knight to a4, likely planning to capture the d5 pawn in the future. In response, black developed naturally with bishop to c5, but instead of capturing your central pawn, white played pawn to f3, attempting to dislodge your knight from e4. This looks like a strong move for white, since your knight doesn't have many safe squares to go to. Knight to g5 is possible but awkward, and white seems to have the upper hand. But here's where black strikes back with a devastating counterattack. The surprise blow. Queen to h4. Check. At first, it might look like a hopeful trick. If the king moves, then queen to f2 would be checkmate. But white can simply block with pawn to g3, and now it appears black's queen is trapped. Not only is the queen attacked by the pawn, but so is the knight. It looks like black will lose material next move. But here comes a spectacular tactical idea. Pawn to d3. This move opens up the diagonal for the dark squared bishop, and at the same time sets up a lethal threat. Knight to f2, or a devastating bishop sacrifice. White thinks, well, I'll just capture the queen now and win. But then comes the brilliant finish. Bishop to f2, check. The king has no choice but to go to f1, and then bishop to h3 delivers a checkmate. A brilliant 10 moves checkmate. If you found it helpful, consider subscribing. Your support means a lot and helps me keep bringing you the most effective, well-researched chess strategies. Thanks for watching.